Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to our channel, AI Era Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom.
It's great to be back for another deep dive.
Today, you've really tasked us with something fascinating. We're diving into Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir's book, Hazrat Abu Bakr As-Siddiq.
And specifically, we're looking at the ethical framework for conflict that was established right at the very beginning of the caliphate.
Right. Our mission today is all about command responsibility and ethical warfare. And what's so striking is that this isn't just a historical curiosity. It reads like a modern manual on how power can maintain its legitimacy.
It really does. It's a highly structured policy. You can see the thought that went into making sure that the use of force, even when it's legitimate, doesn't undermine the moral authority of the state itself.
So the big question for us today is, how did this very early Islamic state set these boundaries? And more importantly, why do these ancient rules still feel so relevant in our world of high-tech warfare, AI, and automated systems?
That's the core of it. The source material lays out this incredible system built on, well, a few key things. Accountability, really strict discipline, and this absolute protection of non-combatant life.
And we're going to connect those ideas directly to the challenges we face today. So can a framework designed for, let's say, the sword and the horse, give us the ethical firewall we need for the drone and the algorithm?
A huge question.
It is. Before we jump in, just a quick request to you. If you find this exploration valuable, please do subscribe to our channel, like this video, and maybe share it with friends who are also curious about these intersections of history, ethics, and technology.
Your support really does drive these conversations, so let's get into it.
All right. Section 1. Authority carries personal responsibility. This feels like the absolute starting point for everything else.
It is. It's the foundation. The source material makes it crystal clear that the Caliph Abu Bakr held his commanders personally answerable.
That word personally is doing a lot of work there, isn't it? This isn't some abstract systemic responsibility.
Not at all. It's not the system failed or we'll launch an inquiry. It was you, the commander, are answerable for the actions of every single soldier under your command. It's a radical retention of ethical oversight at the highest level.
So in practice, what did that look like? If a commander is given an order, they're responsible for not just the tactical outcome, but the moral quality of it.
The moral quality of it, that's a perfect way to put it. In so many other empires at the time, a victorious general was basically given a free pass. As long as you delivered the victory, no one was going to look too closely at how you got it.
Right. The ends justified the means.
Exactly. This framework just cuts that logic off at the knees. It completely removes the possibility for a commander to say, well, I didn't know, or the men got out of hand. Accountability rested squarely on that one individual for the ethical execution of the mission.
I'm trying to imagine the psychological pressure that puts on a leader in the field. It fundamentally changes your decision-making calculus.
It has to, because it wasn't just a theoretical standard. It was enforced by what I think is the most remarkable detail in this entire section.
Let's hear it.
The unforgivable breach. The principle that military success never, ever excused misconduct.
Wow. Okay, unpack that for us.
A victory that was achieved by violating the moral code, say, by killing non-combatants, torturing a prisoner, destroying a sacred site, that victory was formally classified as a failure of command.
So you could win the battle, but lose the moral war and be punished for it.
You would be. Imagine you're a commander. You've just taken a critical fortress, secured a vital supply line, achieved a major strategic objective, but you find out your troops, in the heat of the moment, mutilated the bodies of the dead.
Which was probably a common practice in warfare at the time.
Absolutely. But under this system, you could be recalled, reprimanded, or worse, because that action, that moral violation, was seen as more damaging in the long run than the tactical gain was beneficial.
It elevates morality above pure utility. It rejects that kind of cost-benefit analysis where you say, well, a little bit of cruelty helped us win faster.
It structurally opposes it, and the logic is actually very pragmatic. If you win a battle but you act unjustly, you've just shown everyone, your own people, your allies, your enemies, that your state is willing to abandon its principles for a short-term gain.
And that makes your state look predatory, not legitimate.
Predatory, unreliable, and ultimately weak. Because its authority is based on force, not justice. The source suggests the state's reputation, its moral brand, if you will, was more valuable than any single fortress.
I think that concept of political capital is so important. If you're fighting a war that you claim is about justice, but your actions on the ground are unjust, You completely forfeit your reason for being there.
You do. You become just another warlord. And this is why leadership in this framework becomes entirely about answering for outcomes. You can't shift blame. The buck stops with the commander.
So the commander, even if they're miles away from the frontline action, is still the ethical custodian of the entire force.
That's it. And that structural reality, that pressure, forces the ethical mandate to cascade down through the entire organization. If you, as a commander, know your career and reputation depend on the ethical outcome, you're going to enforce discipline with an iron fist.
Which brings us to the follow-up. How did they make sure this wasn't just a set of nice ideas? You mentioned enforcement.
Right. This is the accountability after action piece. This wasn't just about setting rules at the outset. It was about rigorous, institutionalized enforcement afterward.
Like an after-action review.
Exactly, but with a primary focus on ethics. The sources are clear that commanders were subject to mandatory reviews, very detailed questioning, and correction after the campaign was over. It was a built-in quality assurance system for morality.
How deep would those reviews go? Are we talking about just checking the big picture or getting into the weeds?
They seemed to be exhaustive. They weren't just counting captured territory. They were verifying conduct. So imagine commander returns victorious, but then reports start filtering back from, say, local governors or even from the civilian population about misconduct.
A village was burned that shouldn't have been.
Precisely. Or supplies were looted. That commander would be brought in and forced to answer for those allegations directly. They couldn't just say, well, war is messy.
So the state was actively auditing its own use of force.
Yes. And in doing so, it was sending a powerful signal to everyone. To its own soldiers, we are watching. To the civilian populations, you have recourse. And to its enemies, we operate by a different, higher standard.
What was the core rationale for that constant auditing? It must have been administratively burdensome.
It's twofold, and both reasons are highly pragmatic. First, on a tactical level, misconduct alienates the local population. That makes governing harder, it fuels insurgencies, it complicates everything down the line. But the second reason is more critical. It damaged the state's broader moral authority. An act of injustice by one commander was seen as a systemic risk. It was a crack in the entire ethical foundation of the state.
So by reviewing and correcting, they were creating this constant feedback loop for ethical behavior.
A robust feedback loop. It ensured morality wasn't just a soft suggestion you'd find in a preamble. It was a hard, measurable operational standard. It transformed ethics from a wish into a non-negotiable item on the ledger.
If you were going to claim moral legitimacy, you have to show the receipts.
That's it, exactly. And that institutional rigidity in the service of an ethical ideal is what gives this historical model such incredible enduring power.
Okay, so if that's the high-level principle of responsibility, it had to translate into very specific orders. Let's move into Section 2 and look at the actual rules of engagement that were handed down.
This is where the philosophy becomes a practical manual for a soldier on the ground. These prohibitions are just astonishing in their detail and frankly, their foresight.
They feel incredibly modern.
They predate the Geneva Conventions by over a millennium, yet they cover many of the same core principles. They show a clear, policy-driven approach to limiting the scope and brutality of conflict.
So let's get into the specifics. The first category is the protection of human life. The source says, do not kill non-combatants. Simple enough.
Simple, but they didn't leave it there. They went further and specifically named the most vulnerable groups: women, children, and the elderly.
Why was that specific naming so important?
Because it removes all ambiguity. In the chaos of 7th century warfare, a civilian population could easily be seen as a resource or an obstacle or a target to break the enemy's will. By explicitly naming these groups, the authority puts a firewall around them. They are off limits, period. No exceptions.
It's an operationalization of the principle of distinction, isn't it? Separating combatants from non-combatants?
It is. It ensures that the war remains focused on the enemy's military force, and it prevents it from spiraling into the strategic terrorization of the general population, which, as we just discussed, is the fastest way to destroy your own legitimacy.
It's a massive check on that slide towards total war. But the prohibitions didn't stop with human life. They extended to the environment and property.
Which is, I think, just as revolutionary. The source says, do not destroy crops or homes.
That's fascinating to me, because scorched earth tactics have been a staple of warfare forever. Destroying the enemy's ability to feed themselves seems like a pretty effective strategy.
Effective if your only goal is to annihilate. But it speaks to a much more sophisticated political vision. If you destroy the crops and the homes, you're making the territory you plan to govern uninhabitable. You're creating a refugee crisis and a famine that you will then have to manage.
Exactly. You're undermining your own long-term political goal, which is stable governance. By prohibiting this, the state was signaling something profound. It was saying, our conflict is with their army, not with their people or their ability to live.
So they were treating civilian infrastructure not as a tool of war to be destroyed, but as a future asset to be protected. An asset belonging to the people that the state would eventually have a responsibility towards. It's a civilizing impulse in the midst of incredible violence.
And then there's the protection of dignity and belief. Do not violate worship places and do not mutilate bodies.
Two more critical pillars. Protecting places of worship is a strategic masterstroke. It ensures the conflict doesn't become a religious crusade, a pogrom. It guarantees a degree of religious freedom even for your adversaries.
It keeps the conflict political and military, not existential.
Right. And the prohibition against mutilating bodies, that speaks to the internal discipline of the army itself. Such acts are born from rage, hatred, and a desire for revenge.
Things that are toxic to good order and discipline.
The most toxic. It prevents the soldiers from descending into barbarism. It forces them to maintain their humanity and, by extension, the humanity of the state they represent.
This all flows into source point 3, discipline over aggression. The idea that victory isn't a license for excess.
This is the internal battle. The source talks about the conscious choice for restraint over rage, order over chaos, and purpose over cruelty.
And that's maybe the hardest part. Any army can be aggressive, but to be victorious and then show restraint, that's a different level of strength.
It's the ultimate test of moral and institutional strength. When the adrenaline is pumping, when you've just seen your comrades fall, the instinct is for retribution. To hold back in that moment requires profound training and a deeply embedded ethical code.
And the source argues that this discipline is what preserves the state's moral legitimacy. The Army's conduct is basically the most visible advertisement for the character of the state.
It's your brand in action, and if your brand is justice and order, you can't have your soldiers creating injustice and chaos. It's a contradiction you can't sustain.
That brings us to a really crucial distinction made in the source material. It says civilian safety was established as a formal policy, not just a discretionary act of mercy.
Yes, this is a monumental point, and we need to sit with it for a moment.
Tell me why that distinction is so important. Mercy versus policy.
Mercy is arbitrary. It's granted or withheld based on the mood of the commander, the ferocity of the battle, or the perceived worthiness of the recipient. It's unpredictable.
And it keeps the population in a state of fear because they never know if they'll be the beneficiaries of that mercy.
Exactly. It's a tool of tyrants. A tyrant uses fear and selective mercy to control people. But a legitimate authority operates under the rule of law. And law is policy. It's universal, predictable, and non-negotiable.
So, by making civilian protection a mandatory policy, the state was essentially giving rights to people even in the midst of a conflict.
That's a fantastic way to put it. It guarantees that the state's use of force is regulated and consistent. And critically, it's auditable. You can check the commander's actions against the policy.
A population that is subject to mercy is a population of subjects. A population subject to policy is a population of citizens with protections.
Even if they are currently on the opposing side. That predictability is the absolute bedrock of trust. It's how you begin to build a foundation for post-conflict governance, even while the conflict is still raging.
So this entire structure wasn't just about being good. It was deeply strategic. Let's dig into that in Section 3, the actual strength of this moral authority.
Yes, let's synthesize the why behind all these rules. This framework was built on a really sophisticated understanding of power dynamics.
The source material draws a sharp line between short-term and long-term power. It says fear creates only temporary obedience.
And that's an insight that echoes through history. You can terrorize a population into submission, absolutely. But that submission lasts only as long as you have your boot on their neck.
The moment you turn your back, or a stronger power appears, that obedience evaporates.
It evaporates into resentment and rebellion. The source argues that true, lasting submission, the kind that becomes loyalty, isn't created by fear. It's created by justice.
So when the Army operates with this incredible discipline and fairness, following these predictable rules, what does that do to the population they're engaging with?
It shows them that this new authority isn't just another predatory force. It's an orderly, governing body that operates on principles. It makes the idea of voluntary assent, of actually accepting this new rule, possible.
It gives them a reason to submit beyond just raw fear.
It gives them a reason to believe the system might actually be better. This is how the ethical standard becomes its own power source. It gives the state a massive political advantage. Moral superiority.
And when you have moral superiority, you can attract loyalty. You can encourage defections. You reduce the need for constant, expensive, violent coercion to keep order.
Because the population starts to accept the system as fundamentally just, they begin to police themselves in a way because they have a stake in its stability.
Which brings us to what feels like the mission statement for the entire framework from source point 8.
It's the perfect summary. Force without ethics destroys authority. Ethics give force legitimacy.
Let's break that down. How does an army's conduct on a battlefield in some remote province directly impact the political authority of the state back in the capital?
Because in an era without mass media, the army is the state for most people. Their conduct is the only interaction people will have with this new power. If that interaction is defined by cruelty and injustice, then the state is seen as cruel and unjust.
And that perception has real consequences.
Massive consequences. Loyalty erodes. Insurgency becomes a chronic problem. The state becomes structurally unstable because it has to constantly spend resources putting out fires, relying on coercion rather than consent.
You can look at so many empires that just crumbled from within for this exact reason. They won every battle, but their cruelty meant they never truly won the peace.
This framework seems designed specifically to inoculate the state against that kind of structural instability. It makes ethical conduct a strategic imperative for long-term survival.
So by setting this higher standard, the authority built a reputation for fairness, and that reputation became a strategic tool.
A powerful one. It's the difference between being feared and being respected. Fear requires constant, costly vigilance. Respect, which is born from justice, is self-sustaining. It encourages collaboration.
But I have to ask the critical question here. Did this commitment to ethics ever come at a tactical cost? Surely there were times when following these rules made things harder.
That's a crucial point. The answer is almost certainly yes. Think about the rule against destroying crops. If you're besieging a city, the fastest way to win is to starve them out.
And this framework forbids that, so it might prolong the conflict.
It might. It might cost more lives among your own soldiers in the short term. The sources suggest that the leadership understood this trade-off and consistently chose the long-term strategic gain, the gain in legitimacy, over the short-term tactical advantage.
Are there specific examples of that choice being made?
There are accounts of commanders being recalled or publicly reprimanded for actions that, on the surface, led to a quick victory. But the caliph determined that the method they used had damaged the state's moral reputation.
So the message was unambiguous. A slower, ethical victory is always better than a quick, unethical one.
Always. Because the first one builds the state, and the second one begins to dismantle it from the inside out. It required incredible moral confidence to enforce that, but it ensured they were building a sustainable political entity, not just a temporary military one.
Okay, that is a powerful foundation. Now we have to make the big leap. Let's move to Section 4 and talk about how this all applies to our world today.
This is where it gets really challenging and really interesting. How do these 7th century principles hold up in an era of remote warfare, AI, and automation?
The source material points us towards modern military, policing, and specifically AI security. It seems the core principles are still valid.
They are, because they address the fundamental problem of how power is delegated and used, regardless of the technology. The model demands 3 things we are desperately grappling with today: clear operational limits, a civilian-first protection policy, and personal accountability.
Let's start with those clear operational limits. In the 7th century, that meant don't burn the olive groves. What does it mean today for a drone operator or a cyber warrior?
It means defining incredibly strict rules of engagement for kinetic strikes. It means setting clear geographical and temporal limits for surveillance technology. For an algorithm, it means constraining its decision-making parameters so it can't run amok.
And the challenge is making those limits auditable when the operator might be an algorithm moving at machine speed.
Precisely. Which is why the second principle, civilian-first protection, has to be the default policy. When you're designing a system, whether it's a facial recognition tool for the police or an autonomous weapons system, the primary design constraint cannot be mission success at all costs.
It has to be mission success within the absolute constraint of minimizing civilian harm.
Yes. If the system's design prioritizes the target over the uninvolved person next to the target, it has already failed the ethical test that was established 14 centuries ago.
This brings us to the biggest challenge, the one we have to spend real time on: automation and AI. How do we apply this principle of personal accountability to an autonomous system?
This is the existential question of modern warfare. The historical precedent is absolutely relentless on this point. If force is used, a human being must be answerable for the consequences.
But if an AI-powered drone misidentifies a target and strikes a wedding party instead of a military convoy who is personally responsible, the machine can't be put on trial.
It can't. Therefore, the accountability has to trace back up the chain to a responsible human. And this is where our current systems are failing.
Because that human commander might be thousands of miles away. They're looking at a screen, relying on data fed to them by an algorithm they probably don't fully understand. How can their responsibility be the same as a commander on a horse, seeing the battlefield with his own eyes?
The historical framework would argue that the moral contract doesn't change just because the technology does. If the distance and complexity of the technology are used to dissolve accountability, then the force being used is, by definition, illegitimate.
So what's the solution? Do we have to redesign the entire way we deploy AI?
I think we do. We have to build systems where human oversight and accountability are clearly defined at every single stage of what they call the kill chain. The operator is no longer just the person pulling the trigger.
The operator is also the programmer who wrote the targeting algorithm.
And the data scientist who curated the training data, and the supervisor who authorized the system's deployment, and the commander who signed off on its autonomous operational parameters.
That's a whole network of responsibility.
It has to be. If we deploy a system where no single human can be held accountable, we have created an authority that operates outside the rule of law. And the source material has a word for that: tyranny.
Let's use that analogy from before to ground this. Protecting crops and homes. What's the digital equivalent of that in cyber warfare?
The modern equivalent of burning the olive groves is launching a cyber attack that takes down a nation's power grid. It's deploying ransomware against a hospital network. It's disabling a financial system that millions of civilians rely on.
It's attacking the critical infrastructure that supports civilian life.
Exactly. So an ethical cyber command, operating under this framework, would have to design its tools and its rules of engagement to create firewalls around that critical civilian infrastructure.
So a successful cyber attack that shuts down an enemy command center, but also takes down the city's water treatment plant, would be
an ethical failure, a failure of command. Regardless of the tactical gain, it requires an ethical architecture to be baked into the system from the code level up.
Which brings us to the final, and maybe most important, modern application: the auditability of decisions. You can't have accountability without an audit trail.
This is the modern version of that review and questioning process. If an AI makes a decision that results in a catastrophic ethical breach, we have to be able to go back and understand exactly why it happened.
So what would that audit trail need to contain? What data do we need to capture?
We need total transparency. First, the initial human authorization. What were the exact parameters the commander set? Second, the input data. What sensor readings or intelligence did the AI use to make its decision? Third, the algorithmic logic itself. We need to be able to see the why of the AI's choice, which is a huge problem with so-called black box systems.
Where even the creators don't fully understand how it reaches a conclusion.
Exactly. And this framework would demand that we reject that black box structure for lethal systems. And finally, fourth, we need to log the human intervention points. Was there a human in the loop? Did they have a chance to veto the machine's decision?
Without that complete audit trail, accountability is just impossible. The commander can always just shrug and say, the algorithm did it.
Which is an abdication of the very essence of command responsibility. We come back to that core danger of unrestrained power. It doesn't matter if the power is wielded by a human filled with rage or an algorithm devoid of empathy. Power without strict, auditable, human-enforced restraint will always become abuse.
The source is basically a 1,400-year-old warning that our technology must always be subservient to our morality.
And if we let our machines operate outside of that human moral oversight, the state that deploys them will ultimately sacrifice its own legitimacy, no matter how powerful its technology becomes.
What an incredible through line from the 7th century to today. This has been a really deep look at how a historical framework can give us the tools to think about our most pressing modern problems.
To quickly recap the whole thing, first, Personal accountability is the absolute non-negotiable foundation. Victory is never an excuse for misconduct.
Second, that accountability is enforced through explicit policies that protect civilians, their property, their environment, and their sacred spaces.
And third, this entire system of restraint and justice isn't a limitation on power. It's the very source of its legitimacy and its long-term strength.
It's a profound lesson that governance, especially when it involves the use of force, has to be a moral project first and a military one second. And as we head into this future of increasingly autonomous systems,
We have to face this enduring demand for human accountability. And this leaves us with a really provocative thought. The historical precedent we've been discussing, laid down 14 centuries ago, mandates clear, personal, human responsibility for every single consequence of force.
regardless of the tool, whether it's a sword or a self-learning algorithm.
Exactly. But if our new automated systems are blurring the lines between the commander's plan and the weapon's execution, if they operate at speeds no human can truly follow, is it even possible anymore for a human to remain genuinely, personally accountable? Or does the very nature of AI challenge this entire 1400-year-old concept of command responsibility?
The power is being automated, but the responsibility must remain human. So we leave you with this to consider. What specific mechanisms of transparency and oversight must you demand from the organizations and governments deploying these systems to ensure they hold on to the moral authority that is required for the legitimate use of force?
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.